Okay, should we go? Should we go? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm Charles Lee. I'm with the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I'm really excited to have to moderate this panel today. Um, and it is, I think, something that is a long time in coming. The issue of cumulative impacts is seen as a truly transformative issue for environmental justice and environmental protection overall. However, it has been rather obtuse and opaque to most people, given some of the complex scientific, legal, and policy issues involved. And perhaps most of you have not seen this, but actually, in real life developments of real life, very significant developments are beginning to take place. And today, we hope to share some of these with you and engage in a dialogue with about what they mean for advancing the practice of assessing and addressing cumulative impacts that disproportionately burden communities with EJ concern. So, for example, a set of principles and approaches is emerging for assessing and addressing cumulative impacts that systematically critiques and move beyond fragmentation in environmental policy and traditional risk assessment. These principles include centering our work on improving the environment and health in overburdened communities, focusing on the disproportionate burden of cumulative impacts, applying a fit for purpose approach for assessing and addressing cumulative impacts, meaningfully engaging communities and incorporating the lived experience through both quantitative and qualitative data, promoting a bias for action, and building systems to operationalize and integrate ways to address cumulative impacts in governmental decision making with a focus on measuring progress and continuous learning. So this panel will focus on some of the foundational concepts that undergird these principles. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council has convened a cumulative impacts work group, and what we will hear from our members of this work group, and I will introduce them when they come on board. So the first of these presentations will be from Professor Sandra Whitehead from the George Washington University, and she's going to talk about utilizing health impact assessment, which is emerging as a really nice way to understand how to structure cumulative impact assessment. So with that, I will turn it over to Sandra.
Thank you, Charles. And am I sharing my own? So, just a moment, it's a little slow. Here it comes. All right. All right. So, as Charles said, I am Sandra Whitehead. I am a professor at George Washington University, and I am the current president of the Society of the Practitioners of Health Impact Assessment. Seem to have lost my slides, guys. All right, just goodness. These things are going to happen. Can you see the slides now?
Not yet. Here they go.
Okay, fabulous.
It's great. Okay.
All right. It's a little slow with the uptake. All righty. Not as fast as it could be. So one of the reasons that we need to address cumulative impacts is because of the way that decisions are made in environmental context, and especially in environmental regulatory context. Oh, you can finally see the SOFIA slide. I apologize. I mentioned that I'm the president of SOFIA, and we really are the accrediting body for health impact assessment and health and all policies, and we create high quality resources that move us along in this field. This is me. All right. So I mentioned that the reason we need cumulative impact assessment is because there are all kinds of barriers to equitable decision making. And the current regulatory context is extremely fragmented. We have regulatory decisions being made by local government, by regional governments, by state governments, and of course by the federal government, the EPA, and other federal agencies. And we've had this reliance or this bias towards risk-based science exclusively, not looking at what exists already, but actually, can you see the slides still? I'm sorry. There they are. But actually trying to look at, now it's responding, thank you. The ability of agencies to consider existing differential burdens, disparities, or the social determinants of health, which are where people, the ability of people to be healthy and safe and to live a full and rich life in their current context. And so whenever we think about this risk-based format, and we're not thinking about the people part, just the science part, we don't do a good job to solicit community input into the process in a meaningful way. And a lot of the tools that currently exist to assess, but not to address the impacts. And on the back end, we also need a way to monitor health and equity outcomes, which are not usually the focus of environmental regulation. So there are tools out there to look at public health outcomes and regulatory decisions, right? These mapping tools that help, like CGEST or EJ Screen, that really help us zero in on where communities are that need help. But that's a very gross level, right? It's a very elementary level. And then a health matrix, which would actually look at different levels of risk over time for a particular outcome or community. And the use of cross-sector data, bringing in economic and health and environmental data all together to create a real picture of what the real outcomes of these processes are. Health notes analysis is one step above that, where you're starting to zero in on a particular decision or policy and look at the predicted implications. And a health note is usually on a piece of legislation or an ordinance, right, that really looks at predicting the impacts of that ordinance should it be enacted. Very prospective. Health impact assessment and cumulative impact assessment are the ones that we're going to focus on today in my part of the presentation, but also know that this is part of a larger health and all policies framework that communities can use to examine all of their regulatory. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is health impact assessment. And health impact assessment is a systematic process. It's a stamped out process with 6 phases that uses a wide variety of data sources and analytic methods. It uses stakeholder input to look at something that hasn't happened yet. One of the P4s, a policy, plan, project, or program that has impact on the population. And the most important thing about HIA is it gives you a way to recommend and monitor those, to recommend changes to the policy, program, or project, and to manage the impacts on the back end. So the process really is screening. Is an HIA right for this decision? And then scoping, which is how you define and parameterize the project. What decisions are we looking at? What impacts are we looking at? How many? At what point are we going to engage the community and gather and integrate their impact through the process, their input? And then the assessment phase is where you're predicting the impacts. You're using a set of analytic tools to predict the impacts. And then recommendations is where you're working with your community to co-create the recommendations that will staunch the negative impacts of the policy plan or decision and really amplify the positive impacts. And then reporting is reporting those findings, those recommendations to the decision makers. And on the back end, evaluating and monitoring, evaluating your process, but also evaluating and monitoring the impacts over time so you can make adjustments to the process. And the reason that I think HIA is a great framework for cumulative impact assessment is because there's so many definitions of cumulative impact assessment. There's competing frameworks and definitions out there right now, and it's early in the process. But using HIA as the framework will give us a lot more credibility and robustness to the process, because HIA is well established in national and international practice. There is a set of minimum elements and practice standards that defines what an HIA is, how you do it, what it is not, how to get community voice and integrate it into HIA. Taking this mixed methods approach is well established in HIA, which I really and truly believe we need in cumulative impact assessment. HIA is scalable, right? We talked about different levels of decision making. If you have a tool that can be used at the neighborhood level, at the city level, at the community level, right, you can see how that would be useful to informing decisions. And then HIA centers around communities and community voice, except for one kind of HIA, which is a desktop, which I won't go into today. But just know that it's very important to have community, not just at the table, but actively participating in each and every phase of an HIA. That is part of the minimum elements that are required. And it also considers a broad range of impacts across the social determinants of health and makes recommendations to address them. Charles talked about that bias towards action. This is HIA's bias towards action. You're not just assessing it, you're making a plan for how you're going to fix it. Cumulative impact assessment is what I think of as the next version of HIA. It's HIA done better. And it takes into account not just existing conditions, which you would in HIA, but also structural and historical factors like racism, redlining, zoning codes over the years, and the impacts of those on the built environment, right? If you think about communities that have been redlined, you see health disparities. There was a session this morning talking about, the health disparities that arose because there weren't trees in this neighborhood and the heat, right? All of these things come from these structural factors. So for cumulative impact assessment to really be effective, we have to look at what's happening in this neighborhood already. We have to listen to the people who live there and have them tell us what's happening there, not just look at our data, because this is the history of the place. This is what's really going on. And whenever you're looking at these factors that exist that contributed to your existing factors in a cumulative way, then you can start to solve those problems instead of just starting with the one decision. So that's why I say it's better than HIA. It's HIA 2.0 in some ways, because a lot of the underlying principles that have been coming out of our work in the NEJAC work group are really fundamental, right? No community should bear disproportionate burden of the adverse impacts, right? That's just fundamental to EJ work. The historical burden should be considered. That's the cumulative part, right? Looking at all of the burden that exists already and trying to do something about that too. All communities should have a voice in their in decisions that impact them, and not just a voice, but equal voice. And Ben's going to talk about his research on that in the next panel. And cumulative impact assessment should also be scalable, flexible, and easy to understand. Communities should not be locked out of the system because it's too technical or it can't be understood, right? It should be for everyone. And the process should reduce the burdens and not create new ones, right? It's that bias towards action. This is a working model, which it's a draft, and I appreciate Charles allowing me to share this. But this is kind of their working model of what they're trying to do at EPA to overlay this process, this new cumulative impact assessment process onto HIA. And I'm not going to belabor this, but as you can see, it has a lot of overlap and commonality. And this slide is, as I said, a work in progress, but it gives you an idea of how we're starting to think about it and shape this through the different phases. And then my last couple of points is both of these processes consider impacts from multiple stressors as well as historical and existing burdens. It has this bias towards assessing and addressing these burdens. It centers community in the process by working with community members and making sure that they're included and paid for their time. And it uses existing EJ tools to set comparison sets instead of always comparing everyone to white people. And then including how to mitigate harms and harm over time. And then the very last thing is quantitative and qualitative, making sure that community voice is given weight. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that great presentation. Our next one is going to be about incorporating community knowledge and the actual lived experience in environmental assessment and decision making. And we're going to hear from Professor Benjamin Pauly from Kettering University. He's going to offer us a very unique perspective on this question because not only because of his own research and thinking about this, but because he's a resident of Flint, Michigan, and a community activist. And it's through that lens, I think, that we're going to hear a very unique and compelling perspective on this issue. Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Charles. Let's see if I can get my slides shared successfully here. Just go ahead and share my entire screen, I guess, if that works. And please let me know if you can see these.
Yep, there they are.
Okay, when the slides are up, I can't see everyone. So if something's going wrong, please stop me. So thanks, Charles, and thanks everyone for participating in this conversation today. Of course, my kids are getting home right as I start my presentation. I'll talk to you in a bit. I should say quickly that while I am a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, as this slide indicates, I'm not speaking on behalf of the council in any way. So what I'd like to talk about in my allotted time is the role that so-called lived experience and the people who have it can and should play in assessing and addressing cumulative impacts. I suspect the term lived experience is already a familiar one to most, if not all of you. But in this presentation, I'm not going to take it for granted that it's obvious what it is, why we should value it, and how it should be incorporated into decision-making. And the reason for that is that I think we are at a pretty critical regulatory turning point that will require us to get very careful, clear, precise, and consistent about how we use the term if it's going to be relevant within a regulatory context. So a wise man by the name of Charles Lee argues in a recent paper that the environmental justice movement is on the cusp of making some real progress around its holy grail issue, namely identifying and addressing the cumulative effects of multiple environmental, public health, and social stressors. It was always obvious to people living in EJ communities that these effects existed and deserved to be taken seriously. But their own personal accounts of cumulative impact have not always been enough to inspire concern and action on the part of decision makers. What has changed in recent years, Charles suggests, is that we have developed more scientifically rigorous assessment tools that have allowed us to, quote, journey from describing to quantifying to mapping cumulative impacts. This has created the possibility that cumulative impact assessments will actually be used as the basis of regulatory decision-making in ways that really matter and that are defensible in court and so on. So cumulative impact assessment's journey toward relevance may have begun on the ground with the descriptions of impact that first inspired moral outrage and gave birth to the EJ movement. But it culminates up above, looking down upon society through a quantitative lens. And it's only at that point, it seems, that it stands a chance of significantly influencing regulatory outcomes. Incidentally, we see a similar dynamic within many examples of so-called community or citizen science, a shift from describing environmental issues in everyday terms to trying to capture them in a more quantitative language that is likelier to be taken seriously by the powers that be. It might seem that the more we abstract from the specificities of impacted bodies and communities, the stronger our case becomes that we're talking about a real problem that demands to be addressed. But it's not quite that simple, as Charles writes in his paper. No mapping tool or analytical methodology is ever going to be able to capture all the real-life complexity of a disproportionately impacted community. Hence, the need for local knowledge and the ability of communities to speak for themselves will always remain. In fact, this speaks to the continued importance of qualitative information in environmental analysis and decision-making. But there are still a lot of questions about how exactly qualitative information about impact is supposed to fit into this new assessment landscape. And before we even get to that, there are questions about whether others are as convinced as Charles is of its relevance. And I'd like to share a quick anecdote to illustrate that latter point. I've been serving on a work group under the National Drinking Water Advisory Council to EPA that has been asked to recommend revisions to rules that are aimed at stopping the spread of deadly waterborne bacteria, among them Legionella, which is responsible for Legionnaire's disease. Legionnaire's disease is the deadliest waterborne disease in this country, but it's deadlier for some more than others. As this CDC data illustrates, African Americans are more than twice as likely to contract Legionnaire's disease as whites. This is a classic case of disproportionate impact. And we were disproportionately impacted right here in Flint, where I live. Beginning in the summer of 2014, shortly after our drinking water supply was switched to the Flint River, we experienced one of the most severe outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease in American history, leading to at least 12 deaths. But of course, showing that something is having a disproportionate effect doesn't show you how it's cumulative, how it intersects with and compounds other sources of impact. And that's really important with something like Legionnaire's disease because Legionella is an opportunistic pathogen. It preys on people who are already vulnerable in some way, who have underlying health conditions, for example. So I was asked by the facilitator of the aforementioned work group to talk to the group about the Legionnaire's issue from an environmental justice perspective. And I thought the best way of doing that would be to have someone from Flint who'd had Legionnaire's do the talking. Long story short, we went back and forth about this, and I kept being told that there were too many people in the group who wouldn't see the relevance of listening to an anecdotal account from a Flint resident. Finally, I said, well, just let me show a 2-minute video clip of a young woman from our community named Jasmine McBride. Jasmine contracted Legionnaire's disease in 2014. It exacerbated health problems she was already experiencing, and ultimately she passed away at the age of 30. To listen to her tell her story and to see her struggle, even if only on the screen, is to understand in a deeper and more nuanced way, I think, the reality of the impact we're talking about here. But again, I was told, no, we probably shouldn't show the video. So in this work group, we will end up spending about a year talking about microbial threats in drinking water without taking so much as 2 minutes to hear from someone who was actually impacted by the problems we're trying to solve. And this is despite the fact that one of the main charges given to the group by EPA was to evaluate the environmental justice implications of the microbe issue. Apparently, prioritizing environmental justice doesn't mean hearing from EJ communities. It means looking at quantitative data on disproportionate and cumulative impact. So this is why, even amidst all the buzz around EJ and cumulative impacts right now, we need to be really clear about why lived experience matters, what we can conclude from it, and how we can act upon it. It seems to me that we still don't have a framework for that is robust and compelling enough to convince the skeptics and practical enough to be useful. There are, to be sure, many more opportunities these days than in the past for impacted community members to communicate with regulatory agencies about what they're experiencing. But there are still a lot of questions about how much this ends up mattering at the end of the day. What I think we've seen over the years is that regulatory agencies have accepted or been forced to accept that listening to people speak about their lived experience is a matter of principle. From its earliest days, the EJ movement has made a very powerful argument that people from impacted communities have the right to, quote, speak for themselves, to speak about what they have experienced firsthand. This idea has been linked to other principles that we see as being central to democracy, particularly principles of recognition and procedural justice. And that's created the general impression that if you're not giving people a chance to speak from experience, you're not doing democracy right. But I think it's important to note that we can recognize in principle somebody's right to speak, even when we don't really believe what they're saying, even when we think they're misguided, or simply that the information they're conveying is not complete or reliable enough to use as a basis for drawing conclusions or making decisions. And that's why I think now is the time to remind everyone that when people were demanding the right to speak for themselves, it wasn't just a matter of principle. It was because they thought they had critical perspectives on and real and relevant knowledge about impact that wouldn't otherwise be available to decision makers. So what I'm working on right now, and I would love feedback and suggestions, is to try to pull together and clarify our ideas about what kind of perspective lived experience can provide and what kind of information it can convey, with the idea being to evaluate just how deeply it may be able to enter into contemporary cumulative impact assessment. For example, we might metaphorically look at personal stories of impact as smoke that has come to our attention, and now we need to mobilize our fanciest analytical tools to determine if there's really a fire there, as depicted in this super sophisticated graphic. Or we might envision impacted people playing even more of a role in steering us toward the fire through participatory study design and so forth. But one of the big questions for me is, to what extent do we see the reports of impact as being part of the fire itself? To what extent will regulatory agencies ever be able to use those reports as part of the basis for their conclusions and decisions, and not simply as jumping off points? I think that's a pretty important question, especially in cases where we don't have quantitative data, or we have reason to believe that the quantitative data we do have is incomplete. So I know we haven't been able to get very deep here, but I mainly wanted to characterize the lived experience issue and the challenges we face moving forward. The next steps are, I think, firstly, to articulate or re-articulate the epistemological value of lived experience. That is, what it can help us to know that we wouldn't otherwise know. And secondly, to talk about what kinds of practical tools we have or could develop to integrate it into regulatory decision-making in a more robust way. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Ben, for a great presentation. I have an echo, but I just keep on going. So our next speaker is Jerome Shabazz from the Overbrook Environmental Education Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is going to talk about what is called green zones or comprehensive community approaches to addressing cumulative impacts. One of the reasons I think this is really important is because we have to recognize that cumulative impact assessment and action is not some esoteric scientific exercise, but one that's totally rooted in the communities, and that there is a long history of doing work that it does, in fact, start to get us to addressing cumulative impacts. So with that, Jerome, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Let's see if we can get our slides presented. Okay, very good. So again, thank you very much, Charles Lee. Again, I'm Jerome Shabazz, the Executive Director of the Overbrook Environmental Education Center here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we're tasked today with talking about green zones as a comprehensive community approach to addressing cumulative impacts. It was very appropriate for Dr. Pauly to really emphasize lived experience and to migrate beyond quantitative data as the most significant means for measuring progress and success with addressing stressors that are on communities. When we talk about this idea of green zones, we're also looking at a broader context of exposure assessments and really the concept of exposure justice. We need to see the exposure disparities as a broader concept, and we need to be able to see community engagement as a co-produced byproduct of the work that's being done. And so when we look at this concept of green zones, and in many cases they're also called eco districts, they can tend to be stationary or floating districts. Oftentimes they're created by local government to promote sustainable practices, to reduce environmental impacts, and to help revitalize an area that's been burdened with chemical, non-chemical, social, economic, and other stressors. The green zone, ideally in this concept, is an area that's co-produced by communities and local government, not just government in of itself. And it should have the flexibility to focus on a variety of issues related to sustainability, climate, resilience, justice, etc. So the green zone model is typically a place-based strategy and community-led for community-led solutions to transform areas that are overburdened. And these green zones are areas that have experienced historic disinvestment, neglect, most often in low-income communities, communities of color, where residents have been organized for decades to reduce these industrial pollutants and implement solutions to address a more healthier, equitable community life. But when we talk about the idea of green zones, zones in of itself are not new. In my region, Region 3 in Philadelphia, we've worked with zones for many, many years, different types of zones that we've worked with, empowerment zones, opportunity zones, promise zones, but all of these zone structures are not created equal. We have zone structures that are seen throughout the country that are working on very specific initiatives So for example, empowerment zones, it consists of very specific congressional district. They were renewal communities. They were designed to help these so-called distressed urban and rural communities that were eligible for a certain amount of tax credit, bonding, and other benefits. The promise zones were in of themselves structures that had other kinds of federal incentives that enabled communities to theoretically benefit from its legislative structure, and as well as the opportunity zones have very similar tax code benefits for communities in distress. But again, there are always pros and cons in this concept of zoning. So we think of zoning in a beneficial way. It can help protect communities. I don't know how to go back on this. It can help protect communities from. Okay, thank you very much. Help protect communities and enhance property values. Zoning can help implement community goals and objectives. Zoning can conserve existing neighborhoods. We talk a great deal about the burden of communities when they become greener, suffer a disproportionate amount of displacement, and in some cases, outright gentrification. Zoning can help to mitigate that. Zoning can preserve existing structures that have historical and cultural value to those communities. Zoning can prevent the mixing of incompatible land use and structures to protect the dignity and the culture of communities. There's a host of benefit in zoning structures, but there's also detriment as well. You know, at its worst, we have zoning run amok that becomes sacrifice zones, where every derogatory and disparaging infrastructure is transferred to this particular community so as to save others from the burden of fair, equitable distribution. You know, zoning requires a great deal of involvement of property owners, and in many cases, people are required to relinquish property for development. There's arguments around the country now where developers are trying to force people out of their homes for projects that are perceived as being in the greater good of the public. Zoning can discourage some developments in locations. It has the ability to increase costs and property values. So we wanted to make this sort of relationship between healthy zoning structures and unhealthy, unproductive zoning structures as we're talking about the concept of what we think could be a very useful tool as in green zones. But, you know, Dr. Whitehead made reference to the idea that there have been many attempts to have these broader policies that has turned out to be very detrimental to communities, and redlining is one. We always have to keep raising its ugly head in our conversations because, again, these are structural planning tools. And either you plan in the community structure of design outcomes or you're planned out. We have to have a co-produced experience. And as we're looking at this green zone scenario, the green zone has the greater capacity of inclusion, of bringing communities together into decision making so that we don't have the same burdens historically that we've suffered from the past. So we want to talk a little bit about some lived experience. Charles Lee mentioned in the head of this discussion that there are some real world, live and active examples of communities making efforts to integrate solutions around these burdensome strategies within communities, but doing so in such a way where they're including the community in the outcome. And so one example of green zone initiatives is in the state of California. We're going to also reference some that are in Michigan. And so the idea of these structures are set up in such a way where cumulative impacts are looked at. There's sort of common roots and core principles that the community is able to develop around land use, around comprehensive multimedia, and how zoning is broadcast to the community, how people are kept informed, the community-based drivers for solutions are established, cooperative multi-stakeholder governance is established, and the idea overall is to ensure a resource for investment that includes community and reduces gentrification and displacement. So again, you can have good zones, you can have not so good zones, and healthier zones always include community involvement and community impact. So this Minneapolis zone, when we further go through some of the work that they're doing, it's not just the organizing side of it that's important, but it's also its ability to influence policy. And so neighbors get together, they work on high level of environmentalism, working on issues of pollution, race, politics. They're able to get beyond just the issues of the chemical and non-chemical stressors. They're able to talk about social stressors, economic stressors, in other areas, educational stressors that are burdens to this community. Okay, and so ultimately in Minneapolis, their green zones is a place-based strategy initiative. It is aimed at improving health, supporting economic development, and environment and climate. So, you know, when we talk about this issue, one of the potential outcomes is that while each green zone, whether it's in California or in other locations in the country, who've examined this work and have experimented with these strategies, each of them reflect a very specific need for the priorities in the communities where they lie. Environmental justice issues in each community have to be considered. All of them have the potential to lift the voices, the visions of residents, first and foremost, and are comprehensive, community-led solutions, oriented and collaborative. The green zones look closely at the cumulative impacts and unhealthy land use practices. We have to look at how they're based in principles of justice and sustainability. We have to also take into consideration plans to produce high-level, high-quality local jobs and affordable housing. All of the issues that impact quality of life are potential for the green zone strategy for looking at how cumulative impacts are stressing and burdening communities. But the major point that's emphasized in this part of our presentation is none of this is effective without community involvement, without community co-production, and without outcomes that the community can sustain beyond the program initiatives that their local governments may establish. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Jerome. And our last speaker on this panel is someone you all know well, Professor Jacoby Wilson from the University of Maryland. And I think Jacoby is going to talk about the leveraging the science of differential burden. And this is actually a really big, huge issue. And I think it would be a driver towards like fundamental change. So To put this in context, in the EJ space, cumulative impact assessment grew up as an alternative to traditional risk assessment, not necessarily a replacement for it, but an alternative, but a complement to it. And so, in order to really utilize that and bring that, develop that to the fullest, we have to recognize that there's a huge body of science that already exists around differential burden, social determinants, health, and health disparities. So with that, Jacoby, I will turn it over to you. You got to put on your
Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself. I'm trying to get the slides open. Hold on a second. So thank you for that, Charles. So as I open up my slides, just really want to say, when you think about disproportionate burden, and as Charles said, there's a long history of work in this space. I think it's important to note that, as Charles said, there's a lot of research that's been done in this space. And so I think y'all can see my screen now. Let me go ahead and put in screen share mode. So when we think about, again, this history, as Charles mentioned, there's been a lot of science already behind to really support, this work. And when you look at disproportionate burden science, or, the heart of what EJ science is, we wouldn't be where we are today with a lot of the advancements of the institutionalization of environmental justice at the federal level. We wouldn't have the Office of Environmental Justice, new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. We would not have the executive orders 12898 and also the new executive order 14096. So I just want to highlight that science has been really important to driving that work, and also the advancements that we made, not just at the federal level with getting into the culture of federal agencies like the U.S. EPA, but also making sure that we're making progress in actually addressing the problem. So this is just a slide that shows a little bit from 12898. President Clinton's executive order. Also, this definition of overburdened community that came out of WEJAC, White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And so we talk about experience these disproportionate environmental harms and risk. So disproportionate environmental harms and risk. So disproportionate distribution of hazards. I'll get into that more. And this may be result from underlying vulnerability, lack of opportunity, other factors. When we think about the new executive order from President Biden, it goes into more detail. So again, you see this disproportionate and adverse human health or environmental burdens. So these burdens can, and I'll dig into this a little bit more in my slide that's out of order. This can lead due to inequitable access to clean water. So when you think about differential burden, it could be due to access issues. It could be due to lack of representative justice, as was just shared in Ben's presentation, and also highlighted in Jerome's presentation. So let me just get back. So when we think about, at least when I think about and trying to explain disproportionate burden and the science that's been out there, we've had decades and decades of science going back to probably some of Dr. Bullett's early work with the landfill distribution in Houston, Texas in the 70s. Also, early studies in 1982, distribution of facilities, a GAO study. Then also you've had toxic waste and race. I have a few slides on toxic waste and race. When we think about this differential burden of hazards, many cases, the science has been using geography, right? Looking at these issues spatially. So whether it be having point sources of facilities and doing counts and overlaying that with percent people color, percent non-white, percent income for area, doing a host non-host approach where you look at, does a geographic unit of analysis, does it host a facility? So say it's a block group or a census tract or a zip code, even though we shouldn't use zip codes in this work, y'all, it's more, EJ is local, right? So zip codes are unstable, they're too big, but okay. So, and you look at host, so you look at the social demographic distribution, demographics, the percentages of people color, low income, percent renters, percent homeowners, et cetera, in the track, block group, wherever unit analysis that host that facility type versus looking at the percent social demographic composition in the census that unit analysis does not host that facility type. So you got the host non-host approach. We also have buffer analysis, right? So you look at when a certain zone of influence or even impact, depending on which eye you want to use, 1 mile around an area, 2 miles around an area, 3 miles around a facility, 5 miles around a facility, and you want to look at what is the breakdown of the social demographics in that particular zone of influence or zone of impact, right? So that's been some of that work has been around for a long time. So that to me is the heart. And for many of us, when you look at the issue of cumulative impacts, that differential burden of hazards is one part of that equation. Now, I like to add, when you think about the social terms of health, getting back to Sandra's comments in her presentation about social terms of health, there's high concentration of psychosocial stressors. So you can have a high burden of psychosocial stresses also. This is public health, right? This is social epidemiology. This is the work done by Ana Diaz-Rue, looking at folks who are doing work on access to supermarkets and grocery stores and looking at differential, access issues, right? And looking at disease outcomes as relates to higher obesity rates, diabetes rates in areas that don't have access to. People doing work on parks and green space, which is leg 3, right? But that's still that social terms of health work. Access to healthcare, right? Exposure to racism and poverty and impacts on health. Dr. David Williams' work, Nancy Krieger's work. There's a wealth of research to look at the burden of poverty in communities in associations with public health. You look at Healthy People 2010, 2020, I think we have 2030, and looking at these issues of social terms of health. That's also, this science has been out there for a long time, out of the public health space. And then get into leg 3, which I alluded to a little bit, lack of access is not a burden issue, but think about the opportunity cost when you don't have access to healthcare, when you don't have access to green space. That burden, right? The cost burden. That's also part of the evolution of our of the EJ science. And we're looking at burden when it comes to these costs, loss of opportunity, the inequalities related to differential access to natural spaces, trees, etc. So when you look at, I said, historically, toxic waste and race was one of the first studies, 1987, that really got at these issues. And Charles, of course, was part of that work with Bernice Miller-Travis and Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis, United Church of Christ. So it found that race was the most potent variable when predicting where commercial hazardous waste facilities were located. Right? But this was really getting at burden issues. You had systematic reviews that were done by folks like Dr. Paul Mulhern and Dr. Bryant, that whole Michigan conference that happened, I believe, in 1990 and others. And you see that, doing this within a certain zone of influence and impact, look at the percent of people of color versus nearby hazardous waste facilities. You can look at the work of the NAACP and their cold-blooded project and fumes across the fence line when looking at energy infrastructure, again, the burden of dirty energy infrastructure. So both in academic and non-academic settings, in both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed research, you see this work. These different geographic methods, like the host-non-host approach or the buffer approach, this distance-based methods. You see percent people of color in regard to association or the number of folks who may be near these types of hazardous waste facilities. And again, this work has been, they had 1997 toxic waste and race, they had 2007 toxic waste and race, and we still see, again, this high burden on folks of color as it relates to hazardous waste facilities, but other facility types, other LULUs too. And so if you look at this table from the 2007 study, you can see just when it comes to host versus non-host, the ratio, the difference in the distribution of hazardous waste facilities for people of color, percent African American, look at the poverty rate. So again, you have this ratio approach. So you can have a host non-host approach. You can also create a ratio when you can have a reference group. But as Sandra said, we shouldn't always use whites as the reference group. You can use other racial ethnic groups as reference groups. And then again, you can see clustering versus no clustering. So think about cumulative impacts. It's not just the one facility. You can have multiple facilities in the area, right? So you can look at geographically, if you're a fence line community, and studies have done this, looking at comparison of what's on the fence line, whether it be one facility or more than one facility, or you look in a more general area using a buffer approach, again, as I said before. And here's just another a table from this study that looked at these issues at the metropolitan area. So you can look at it at a more regional EPA region level, looking at this burden issues. You can look more of a state level. You can also look at it at a more of a metropolitan level. So again, there's been a lot of work done again in disproportionate burdens. If you just look at this great, I love the 2007 study because it really gave a summary of a lot of the work that's been done, that was done prior to 2007. And if you keep moving forward, again, EJ science is the science of disproportionate burden. Burden disparities when it comes to hazards, LULUs lead to exposure disparities when exposure to pollutants, right? You can also look at air pollution burden. We know that there's higher numbers of facilities and more higher levels of pollutants like particulate matter, involved organic compounds, nitrogen dioxide in communities of color, low-income communities compared to their counterparts. Risk disparities, so you think about climate change and climate risk, and then health disparities again. We've been doing looking at health burden for decades, and that can be leveraged, again, going back to what Sandra said as it relates to looking at cumulative impacts within the HIA framework. And then again, race plays an important role in this. So we think about pollution burden. Some groups have a pollution advantage, and some groups have a pollution disadvantage. It's been a lot of work, y'all, looking at air pollution inequities. And again, that is part of the EJ science. And even when you go bring in segregation again, as Charles mentioned, there's been work done by many scholars like Rachel Merlo-Frosch, some of her work looking at segregation and cancer risk. I've done work looking at segregation and cancer risk. Others have done work on looking at racial disparities in exposure to disinfection byproducts, DBPs. When you think about going back to Ben's comments about what happened with Flint and looking at water-related issues. So you have a lot of work looking at burden when it comes to hazards, burden when it comes to exposure to chemical and non-chemical stressors. As I said before, there's a lot of opportunity to leverage health disparities data when it comes to the work we do. It's not like this is new science, right? So this is also part of that EJ science. And then you think about exposure disparities again. I talked about particulate matter. Think about blood lead levels. Think about asthma burden, right? We see major differences between racial and ethnic groups when it comes to asthma, diabetes, I think stroke, and other health outcomes. And so when you think about, asthma, for example, again, Black Americans are nearly 1.5 times more likely to have asthma. So that's a burden issue. So you think about this disproportionate burden, again, think about disproportionate impacts. We have a wealth of science. And one of the points I want to emphasize, we do not have to look at toxicological endpoints. I think as Sandra mentioned, we can look at differential exposure. And this is a framework that I have, everyone. So hopefully I've shared this with the NEJAC work group previously. But you think about, for EJ work and what we've done traditionally, we've looked at it from more of a systems approach, right? We're talking about place, right? At the meso level, okay? You can go down to the individual level and go down to the micro level, but really where our EJ science is really, evolved. Too excited. Evolved is really from looking at meso place level, everybody. So think about, differential exposure when it comes to vulnerabilities in this third column, right? The ecosystem level policies, population levels, environmental injustice, right? Poverty, unemployment, segregation, individual level. But when you think about looking at burden disparities too, you can do, as I said before, host, non-host. You have these other spatial methods, cluster methods. You have hotspots, cold spot methods. You have more quantitative methods that has been alluded to. There's been a lot of drivers behind it, more community science on the air quality monitoring side, for example. You think about the disproportionate burden getting at these resiliency factors to everybody. And think about the different exposures. Even when you look at our mapping tools, go to Kyle Enviro screen, go to a US EPA screen, look at CGIS tool. These environmental justice screening and mapping tools are also bringing in disproportionate burden. You have categories like pollution burden that may include environmental exposures, environmental effects. That's very important. You have some tools that may be bringing in climate change more. So looking at the burden of climate hazards in the area. You also have some tools that may be looking at other types of burdens. So, for example, lack of access to infrastructure, as was shared in the presentation that Grace T. Lewis did in the last concurrent block about the new tool that EDF has developed, a new national EJ screening tool. So this is just a really interesting framework that digs into exposure, right? When we talk about burden disparities, we talk about disproportionate burden in many ways at the meso level and the more ecosystem level, we're talking about exposure differentials. So you don't have to look at causality. You don't have to look at physiological endpoints per se. You don't have to look at toxicological processes. We already have enough science, and actually going that direction is more of a risk assessment frame. And what we've heard from communities and how our science has evolved is more about being grounded in burden and exposure, which are in some ways could be interchangeable terms. So when you look at these issues in the state of Maryland, for example, you can this is an example of previous work and looking at high risk census tracts by mission source category and looking at versus median household income or proportion of African Americans. This issue of a burden being overburdened by hazards, but also lack of access again to infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure. We've seen that in the state of Maryland, where some communities using this non-host approach, and also the buffer approach that I mentioned before, where you see differences, major differences when you look at percent people color, when you look at poverty levels for both the host approach, host non-host approach, and also the buffer approach. And then you look in the city of Baltimore, you think about this issue of burden and cumulative impacts. Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's at Morgan State, wrote a book called The Black Butterfly. Blacks are hyper-segregated in the butterfly wing. So remember, segregation, as Jerome talked about, it concentrates environmental risk, economic risk, health risk, social risk, right? So from environmental context, you think about the issues of segregation. What does it mean for folks? Think about the burden of the site. Remember my three-legged stool, the burden of hazards, the burden of psychosocial stressors, the burden of lack of access to good infrastructure. Let me show you a few slides. You see the differences when it comes to per home sale prices in the butterfly wings. Again, more blacks and people of color in the wings, and in the body of the butterfly, you have more higher income whites in the body of the butterfly. You can see a spatial pattern, right? Red line in health outcomes. You can see a major difference in life expectancy in areas that were red line versus area non-red line, and look at the differences in life expectancy. So you see a spatial correlation there. Again, this is looking at burden, y'all. You can look at lead cases, right? You look at these maps. Again, GIS is a good way to visualize burden. Again, this is part of the evolution of science. You'll see more lead cases, lead issues in areas that are a red line versus areas that are not red line. Areas that are in the butterfly wings. Look at the spatial pattern again. Baltimore code red. Look at climate issues in Baltimore, and basically found on differences in temperature in the butterfly wings. Higher temperatures in the red line areas and butterfly wings compared to the body of the butterfly, right? And what you can see is there's again spatial patterning. Again, the burden of lack of access to trees, the burden of temperature issues, right? So even in the climate change space, we can bring in the climate science and looking at how you address climate change. It's important to look at who has differential climate risks, who is burdened differentially by climate hazards, okay? And so you can see differences in temperature and health outcomes across Baltimore. And again, remember those butterfly wings. So those hyper-segregated areas. Again, the cumulative impacts of living in areas where you don't have air conditioning, where you have too many impervious surfaces, where there's a lot of poverty, right? Where you don't have trees, when there's too much heat. What does that mean for health? So you can look at these issues intersectionally. Again, the social determinants of health, look at the health disparities, and then again, look at it spatially. So you can look at it together in a composite way, or you can unpeel the onion and look at each burden, right, across different domains: health domain, social domain, environmental domain, and economic domains. I may be out of time, Charles, so y'all cut me off if I'm out of time. But this is one more slide that kind of gets at that issue of looking at a red line again and the burden of segregation, right, and then overlaying that with air pollution and respiratory risks in Baltimore. So again, this is a good example of how you can look at cumulative impacts geographically, spatially, right? You can visualize it, but how you can understand what the burden of hazards, environmental burdens, the burden of environmental pollution, and the burden of not having access to good infrastructure, and what that means for health outcomes. So I think I probably can stop there. I've probably gone too long, but I'll go ahead and pass the mic back to you, Charles. Thank you.
No, thank you, Shakobi, for that. And there's a lot there to build on. I think we're gonna we have about 15 minutes, I think, 15 20 minutes maybe. So thanks to everyone for a great set of presentations. I don't know if you can see people clap, but I hope everybody is clapping. And a really great set of presentations. I think they give a good picture of some of the areas that we need to build out. So we want to start a conversation around this, and get everybody's input. Remember, we are all about co-generation of knowledge and expertise, co-production, co-design, shared activities and leadership. And that's what cumulative impact assessment is all about. So I guess we will ask for people to write their questions in the or comments in the chat. Is there anything I need to do other than to go to the comment box? That's all we need to do to get to the right. So we'll wait for that. So maybe what I can do is just to ask a question before, as we're waiting for people to ask questions. So I wanted to ask Sandra. You talk about health impact assessment being like the next generation of health impact assessment being about cumulative impacts, and I think we're beginning to see some good examples of that in the regulatory space. One of which I think is pretty prominent. So maybe you could talk about that, the one that's taken place in Chicago.
Yeah, I really liked the way that the Chicago Health Department took HIA and used that as a basis for looking at the relocation decision for a recycling plant. There was an application to move a recycling facility into an already overburdened community. And the way that they used the process was very community engaged. It was very much looking at, what exists in the neighborhood before you started to even talk about putting something else there. And they went through, and I think this is probably the only cumulative impact assessment that I've seen that actually took the time to go through each and every phase of the HIA process and to tie that to cumulative impacts practice. And this tool was actually used not just to engage the community around their concerns about the facility, but it was used to deny a permit. And I've never seen it be used so effectively before. And I'm hoping that this can be part of this model, this practice that we build on. And I know that EPA has, I think it's 6 pilot projects that are getting ready to crank up. And to me, using the sort of the template that Chicago started using and then modifying that to your purpose, right? This is how we're going to build this practice up, and how practitioners like the members of SOFIA will learn from each other and from great examples like Chicago and Chelsea, which is the new one that's coming online next, I believe.
I did. I asked that for a particular reason because you were here tomorrow at 11:10 a.m. and second of this series of panels around lessons learned from state and local government cumulative impacts permitting experience, and the Chicago Department of Public Health is going to present on their health impact assessment. And the managing deputy commissioner Megan Cunningham and a community partner are going to co-present on their work, not only in terms of the HIA and General Iron in the permit, but also the work that they're doing to build that out into a citywide process for cumulative impact assessment and a cumulative impact ordinance. So more to come. Okay, great. I'm beginning to see other questions. Denise, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pronounce your name right. Thank you for the presentations. Your PowerPoints were present. be shared later to all attendees? The answer I would assume is definitely yes. If I'm incorrect, maybe one of the organizers can correct me. Second one is from D. Williams. Could you talk about a few instances where these studies have helped shape status quo power relationships within corporations and communities? I guess I will open it up for people, but I would just say this is a pretty new area. So the one that Sandra talked about, Chicago, is I think definitely moving in that direction. Not some We don't know what the outcome of the other ones are. There are also processes that have come about as a result of recent legislation to look at cumulative impact. The most important of which is the one that's taking place in New Jersey, where the law called for a mandatory denial of permits if a disproportionate impact can be seen, and that would also be presented tomorrow at that session I talked about. However, I want to open up to the panelists to talk about, because, and I would broaden the question. It is not what you are thinking about in terms of just a traditional cumulative impact assessment process. When Jerome talked about green zones, there are a lot of these comprehensive efforts around the country, and and I think that we need to also center ourselves in the community, in these community-driven processes, so that this becomes not just a esoteric scientific or policy exercise, but something that's real in the communities, and a lot of them are going on there. I just want to open it up to the audience, because you know a lot about a lot of these. So, Sandra, maybe you can talk about St. Joe, Florida.
Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. You're
Okay.
blacked out, but
the power has gone out at my house again. I'm sorry.
Okay, but we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I'll try with the light. So yeah, St. Joe, Florida is a what are we doing with this flashlight? St. Joe, Florida is in North Florida on the Gulf coastal region, and they have suffered a high disproportionate burden over the years. They had for many years 3 chemical plants that sat right there on St. Joseph Bay, and their population has suffered a great deal, both from disproportionate burdens of the chemical influence, but also from natural disasters, which has exacerbated their issues. They are a fishing community, and in Northport, St. Joe, which is the neighborhood we've been working in through the Florida Brownfields Coalition, EJ Coalition, they have really focused in on thinking about how did their community get this way? How did these burdens get here? Right. And in Northport St. Joe, they have things like their entire subdivision of their housing subdivision where the African American community was built on top of a landfill, which is sinking. So they have huge issues with drinking water, with safe housing, right? Because their homes are sinking into the ground and becoming unstable and unsafe. And so there's been a project there to really empower the community and to work with them. My colleagues at the University of West Florida have done health impact assessment, which they've presented nationally. And that is a community where the power of EJ is being felt and where cumulative impacts are being used to drive the conditions, the changes in the conditions. It's a long way from being anywhere near fixed, but the community dialogue that the HIA has brought out and bringing out community voice and narrative in what is the disproportionate burden and how do we change it has been transformational, and it's been empowering to the community who are standing up for themselves. They actually have come to the NEJAC on several occasions, but the resources that are now coming to that community because of this awareness raising and the HIA that was done, I think is going to be in the long run really beneficial for the community. And I know, Shakobi, you've also been engaged with Kwame and them a little bit on that project.
So let me ask another question because I don't see one on the chat yet. So this is focused to this is meant to for everyone to answer. Now, Ben gave us a great presentation to help us think more deeply about what community knowledge is and what lived experience is and how do we utilize that. Really important questions to address, but at the same time, and he alluded to this in his presentation, there are already a pretty robust set of tools for thinking about gathering community knowledge and incorporating lived experience. And maybe I'll just open it up to you to just kind of talk about. I know Shakobi, you had mentioned, I mean, you just rattle off in the conversation we had with you, just a litany of these tools. So maybe I can start with you.
With me, I'll just be quick. I mean, there are a number of, in the exposure framework that I shared, there are a number of ways to, collect data to help, basically visualize or illustrate cumulative burden. I think for me, the more hyper local type of methodologies I think are more appropriate. So I appreciate, Ben, Ben's comments about how, that lived experience is important. One of the things that we're working on, and I'm not sure how accessible this will be for everybody, but we are working on apps. I know there's apps out there that can help capture the more local level experiences. We can get that quantitative and qualitative data. So I think that's going to be useful for some stakeholder groups, for some who may not be the technology may not be as accessible. That may not be the best way to do it. But I will say, and I'll pass the mic on this point, there are a lot of mapping tools that have gotten better. They're not at the place where it's robust in some ways to look at things temporally, right, and look at tracking some of the impacts as we want them to be tracked. But I would say that the environmental screening and mapping tools are part of this, the outputs of the inputs from community, voices about what's needed to really be able to visualize these issues around disproportionate burden and cumulative impacts. So I would say investing more resources there, I think, is one way to go, but also using things like photo voice and video voice and citizen journalism, I think, is another way to go to capture folks' experiences from a data perspective as it relates to a disproportionate burden and cumulative impacts. So I'll pass the mic.
No, that's great. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I can just piggyback off that quickly. Yeah, so I mean, I think it is worth saying that there are a lot of methods out there that are used by, say, social scientists to collect qualitative data, and often that data is the basis for, academic papers and so forth. It can also be used by community groups. What I'm interested in, though, and what I was referring to mainly in my comments is the possibility that kind of data can enter more robustly into regulatory decision making. And I think that's really where this kind of breaks down, because again, within academia, I think this kind of data has a lot of credibility. But when it comes time to make decisions that are inevitably going to be challenged in the courts, that you have to be able to defend your reasoning on, that's where it gets pretty complicated in terms of determining what kind of data is going to be considered valid and what kind of data isn't. And so, I see that as a real kind of rubber hitting the road issue. And so I think, we can't necessarily, as academics, those of us who are academics, use the same language to defend and justify this stuff to the regulators as we do to our fellow academics, because I think we have a harder case to make. because those are the people whose feet are going to get held to the fire if a decision that they make gets shot down. And so that's why I guess I'm calling for a kind of re-articulation of the value of lived experience that will make it more relevant to people who are trying to think about this stuff in those contexts.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely important to create a whole new space for language that's community driven. And I give you an example. About a month ago, municipality here in Philadelphia was asking for community input on recommendations on how they could use IDA recovery funds and wanted the community to weigh in on it. And so the data was already in. People already knew the impacts. They already knew who was disparate. They already knew who had been disproportionately affected by this storm, this hurricane. The question now is, will the solution be heard because it's not used or expressed through that same lens? And so the academic lens, I mean. And so the question became, was there a framework that will enable the community members to express their interests, express their needs, express their concerns, and still have it be understood by the planners, the city planners? And what came out of that was the idea of this framework of green zones as being an opportunity to have a spatial effect that could be the static or floating that would impact, that have all of these values, these inputs that came from community that would identify what that result should look like. And so I think we, in addition to all of the inputs that we work on in terms of data collection, we also need to create more of the framework. The framework is as important as the input itself when it relates to community engagement. Because if people don't feel welcome, if the language isn't the same, as your ability to contribute is equitably respected, then it's not going to have that co-production that we keep talking about.
Yeah, one of the things that we should add is that, in particular, Jerome's point raises us cumulative impacts, information about cumulative impacts and community, the community's knowledge. I mean, is really important, and it's really, one of the big challenges of this is to incorporate that into the regulatory process, but there's also the planning process. And cumulative impact is a planning issue, at its core. So one comment from Chad Martin basically says, there's a lot of holes to these mapping tools subject to, and that's what we say. That's why this issue of cumulative impact is really important. I mean, of getting community knowledge and qualitative information is really important. And then I would just say also, and to pull the plug in for a person named Christy Ellickson. She was the person that helped that led the writing of the first cumulative impacts, effects, and levels assessment protocol for the state of Minnesota, because that's where the first such law was passed in the country. She is now doing a research fellowship with the New Union of Concerned Scientists, where her question is, how do we start to think about ways in which we can translate community knowledge into and format them or communicate them in a way that's more usable by regulatory decision makers. So if you have any ideas around that, don't just come to talk to us here, but to go, look up Christy Ellickson and the Union of Concerned Scientists. I think that is such important work that's going on in this area. Okay, so I don't see more chat comments in the chat right now. I just want to conclude by saying that this is such a great set of presentations from our speakers. It is really important that we begin to understand that we know a lot more about these issues than we think we know. That in fact, there's a lot going on here. and a lot we can all build off of. It's not starting from ground zero, like as if though we don't know anything. There's a body of history of work in areas directly related to cumulative impacts, but also areas directly associated with cumulative impacts, but areas that are related to cumulative impacts that we can all build on. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank everybody for participating. I wish we could all see you in the audience, but short of that, I hope you all have enjoyed and learned a lot from this session. Thank you.